From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Welcome to this week's episode of the McLaughlin Group. I'm your host, Seth Berenzweig, filling in today for Tom Rogan. Joining us for this show today is columnist Pat Buchanan, Eleanor Clift of the Daily Beast, and Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune. Also joining us today is our special guest, Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. All right, well, we have a lot to cover, so let's get started with issue 1, the Republican National Convention, virtual style. After last week's Democratic National Convention, conducted virtually for the first time due to the pandemic, this week was the Republicans' turn to talk to America and tell their story of why Donald Trump deserves 4 more years as president.
Yet the energy and enthusiasm for who should lead this nation, it is real today as it was 4 years ago.
My grandfather's 99th birthday would have been tomorrow. Growing up, he had to cross the street if a white person was coming. He suffered the indignity of being forced out of school as a 3rd grader to pick cotton, and he never learned to read or write. Yet, he lived long enough to see his grandson become the first African American to be elected to both the United States House and the United States Senate in the history of this country. Our family went from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. And that's why I believe the next American century can be better than the last.
The contrast between the two conventions was stark, with the Democrats nominating Biden as their candidate on a platform of decency needed in the Oval Office, tackling social injustice, fixing an economy crippled by the global pandemic, and what the Democrats believe is an election in which democracy itself is at stake. Meanwhile, the Republicans focused on President Trump's jobs creation, positive economy and stock market growth before the pandemic, defending law and order, and the continuing themes of draining the swamp and putting America first. Have the Republicans this week delivered a clear and convincing message as we head into the November election? Pat.
Seth, I'll tell you, the real speech that set out the framework for this election and the Republican grand strategy was that of Vice President Pence at Fort McHenry. It's going to be a campaign of contrasts, of collisions, us and them. Pence started off talking about the support for the police in opposition to the rioters, arsonists, looters, and how Joe Biden has given them aid and comfort. Joe Biden was portrayed as pro-abortion Catholic and a bad Catholic who's given up on right to life. The Democrats were portrayed as a party that really believes America is shot through with systemic racism, and we're going through a summer of darkness, whereas Republicans believe we're a great and good country and getting greater under Trump. I think it's an effective approach, quite frankly, because it's going to force Joe Biden out of his basement to defend himself, and the Republicans are going to be on the offensive on issues they believe in all the way through to November.
I think doing a virtual convention, it was kind of clunky. I don't think they did as well as the Democrats, and I thought it was ethically really questionable the way they used the White House as a backdrop. But having said that, I think it succeeded from Trump's point of view. The issues Pat mentions are all directed solidly at the base, but the second and third days of the convention, including the speeches that led up to Pence, were about convincing white suburban America, women, that Donald Trump is not a racist, that he really welcomes immigrants. They even showed a naturalization ceremony. He pardoned a Black man who'd been a bank robber and was now doing good things working with felons. Those were all good moments designed to chip away at Biden's extraordinary gender gap, which really is pivotal in the suburbs. He also, I think the convention also succeeded. They put so many Black men and white women on the stage that you would almost forget that the Republican Party is largely a white men's party. They tried to remake president's image and the handling of the pandemic. And if you set aside all the lies and you don't question them, I think it was successful.
Well, politics creates fantasy lands every day, as we know. I expected there to be a lot of exaggeration and outright lies, as Eleanor mentions, and they aren't limited to one side, but we have seen with the Republicans this year, as with 4 years ago, they are trying to remake themselves, getting away from their own stereotypes, and they, I think, didn't really succeed. I mean, let's face it. First of all, this is Donald Trump's party. They didn't even bother to have a platform, a new platform this year. They just said, well, just endorse our platform from 4 years ago. That saved time. The convention was put together in a hurry, and of course put together by Donald Trump. It's the embodiment of his vision, and he's a natural showman. You got to give him that. That's what the Democrats are going to be up against, and they were up against that this time. I think people paid more attention to the Democrats from a policy point of view because of the diverse speakers they had. And with the Republicans, you have Donald Trump as the main attraction, and the ratings were kind of reflected that early in the week anyway, with the lower ratings than what the Democrats had at the end of their convention. And I think this is something that we're going to continue to see.
Inez, what's your take on how the convention's gone this week? And let me also ask you in particular, were you in any way surprised that speakers such as Larry Kudlow were referring to the COVID virus in the past tense? Was there any kind of a credibility issue there?
So first, the general impression of the convention, I agree. I think it was done well. And I think 2 points stood out to me. One, some of the best speeches of this convention so far have not been from politicians. They have not been even from the Trump family. They have been from ordinary men and women, nuns and moms and, teenagers who were smeared by the media. So I think that was a good decision. Actually, I would, if as a viewer, I preferred to see even more of that. And so that's one thing that stuck out to me. And the second piece is the focus on culture war issues. I think very differently than past conventions, over and over again, you hear the issues brought up. First of all, law and order and the riots. Second, school choice has been a huge part of this convention in a way that it hasn't been for past Republican conventions, even though it's been in the platform forever. And abortion has made more than one appearance as an issue. There is a real focus on culture war issues in this convention, and I think that's wise. I think there's actually a broader swath of Americans who agree with Trump on a lot of these culture war issues than necessarily agree with other parts of the Republican platform. So actually, I think those issues are less divisive than many in the media would assume they are, and actually think they do attract more people to the party. I mean, I think that's obvious that Trump has quite low approval ratings, even within his own party, in terms of his handling of the coronavirus crisis. Now, I think some of that is driven by media narratives, but some of it is fair criticism of his administration that did not ramp up testing very quickly. Now we do see that, but that was a criticism in the initial months of the pandemic. And I think it's a fair thing to criticize. However, I do think that the mood of the country is now focused on riots, on the fact that our cities are increasingly fire lit in the evenings, and curfews have to be enforced. And I think that will help Donald Trump. The more focus is on that issue and the less on coronavirus, I think the more it helps Donald Trump in November.
Briefly,
Seth, let me get in here if I might.
Go right ahead.
I think Inez is exactly right. Look at Joe Biden the day of the Pence speech. He came out to denounce needless violence. He was forced to do that by the attacks on him. Before, he's come out and said, I don't believe in defunding the police. Trump clearly has problems as a candidate. He carries baggage. Who voted for Biden, who liked Biden, who started his career. He's going to have to choose between them. Again and again and again, he's going to be forced to do it. And he's going to have to come out of that basement pretty soon because you can't defend yourself against attacks. And when you start counterattacking, you start losing support.
We're going to discuss Kenosha in more detail. And I must say, the convention was tone deaf when it comes to what's going on in the country. The only one who actually acknowledged the pain in the country from COVID was the First Lady. And when you listen to her entire speech, she did fine, except you have to put it in the context that her husband is the biggest bully on social media and her Be Best campaign is laughable at best.
It amazes me how Donald Trump works really hard to kill Obamacare and then brags about how he supports its benefits. He doesn't. And this is something we've become so accustomed to now that it hardly makes news anymore. Will the public, will the voters decide that enough is enough? That's what this campaign is going to be about.
Okay, well, now we must move on to issue 2, the Kenosha killings and the cultural divide. It's been a summer filled with civil rights protests that at times have led to riots in major cities, including Portland, Seattle, Chicago, and Los Angeles, now include the heartland of America, after another tragic police shooting of a black man which occurred Sunday in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
They shot my son 7 times. 7 times. Like he didn't matter. But my son matters. He's a human being and he matters.
Kenosha police were sent to Jacob Blake's address on a complaint of family trouble. A dispatcher notified officers that a woman called police and said, quote, Blake isn't supposed to be there, and he took the complainant's keys and is refusing to give them back to her. In a video recorded by a bystander, Blake is seen scuffling on the ground with 2 officers on the passenger side of a small SUV. Blake proceeded to walk around the front of the car while officers drew their weapons and shouted commands. Blake attempted to enter his vehicle and was grabbed by an officer who then shot him 7 times at close range. Blake was airlifted for emergency medical attention, and he remains in critical condition, paralyzed from the waist down. What impact will these tragic shootings and the resulting protests have on the upcoming election? Eleanor.
Well, it draws a sharp divide between the 2 parties, but it's not as clear-cut as Pat would have you believe, with one party supporting the police and the other party supporting the protesters. Anybody who saw the video of what happened in Kenosha, it is horrific. Nobody should get shot in the back 7 times with 3 little children, his 3 little children watching on from the back seat of a car. I mean, that is totally indefensible. So is looting and firebombing and all the rest of it. And Joe Biden has been clear that he does not support that. He will speak out more forcefully on that. He should. But the politics of this just got way more complicated this week with the major sports teams, basketball, baseball, black and white players joining together. It's 4 years since Colin Kaepernick first used his presence as a football player to demonstrate for the racial injustice in this country. And some of the statements that have been made, the coach, Doc Rivers, who said, listening to the Republican convention, and they're drawing this picture of, we black people are coming to get them in the suburbs. We're the ones who've been hung. We're the ones getting shot.
Pat, do you think that the president's striking the right message here?
What was done to Jacob Blake was inexplicable, and it seems to me inexcusable and indefensible. And we need really explanations of why you would have to shoot an unarmed man, as he appears to be, 7 times right in the back as he's trying to get into a car. We agree on that. Eleanor does, I do, Clarence does, everyone does. But what happened afterward is the reasons why, Seth, you were talking about this issue. An uprising of violence and arson and looting. They got that Jacob Blake's mother denouncing it and saying, my son wouldn't want this. We got the whole country talking about Kenosha, which we haven't talked about, I imagine, for a number of years. Why? It's because this is forcing this issue up to number 1 on the table. And let me say for Eleanor, she denounced the looting and arson far more passionately than Joe Biden has done since he's been in that basement.
Clarence, let me go to you and raise something that happened in the nation's capital a couple of days ago, where diners at Adams Morgan, a neighborhood here in the Washington, D.C. region, were treated pretty roughly by protesters. And it really just raised the specter of chaos that went wild on social media. Obviously, chaos is President Trump's sandbox. How do you think this is going to have an impact on the election? And doesn't part of this play into the president's hands?
I don't think that's going to have much impact directly. What's going to have an impact is what Pat's talking about, is the overall impression that the protesters are evil and that the cops are all good, and that would include that non-cop that vigilante who killed 2 people this week. I mean, this is ridiculous. Look at the convention didn't say anything about the coronavirus, which was 180,000 people, hard to keep count of it all. They didn't talk about that, but they talked about this one episode in Kenosha. And they didn't talk about the episode. They talked about the fact that there were riots against the police. No, riots are bad. That's not protest. That needs to be come down on. Pat is right. We can all agree on that much. But there's also a long history of bad relations between the Kenosha police and the civilian population, just like there is in Chicago, as there is in a number of other cities that have seen these kind of uprisings occur. If you don't put it into that context, then it looks like the people on the street are all evil and unprovoked. It's not that simple.
Inez, there have been so many things that have been happening over the prior weeks, and this week in particular has been accelerating as well. And as Eleanor noted, a lot of the developments and protests that are also emanating through the world of professional sports. At the end of the day, when the voters are looking at all of this, how do you think it balances out as we head into the election season?
As of now, I absolutely think that the rioting in cities that has been going on is now at the forefront of a lot of voters' minds. And I think that's for a couple reasons. One, we're now not talking about San Francisco, LA, Chicago, DC, New York. We're talking about a smaller city in Wisconsin. So I do think that I kind of brought it home for a lot of folks who were willing to dismiss lawlessness in the cities as kind of not their problem. But the second part of it is that we've seen across the board, we've seen poll numbers on BLM dropping, right? And we have seen it kind of slowly dropping over the last few weeks. I would imagine after these incidents, it'll drop a lot more precipitously. And as for supposed vigilantism, which we don't actually know all the details about the Wittenhouse case yet, just as we don't know all the details about the police involved case. But even supposed vigilantism, I think that this is an inevitable consequence when law and order isn't enforced in the cities for week after week. There is a problem. People are going to start defending, they're going to start defending their property, they're going to start defending their neighbors, and sometimes they're going to that's going to result in tragedy, because if you are worried about police brutality, the police take thousands of hours of training, right, to be able to react calmly in hostile situations and dangerous situations. Now, that training doesn't always work, and they certainly make mistakes. But people, ordinary people who are not trained in those kinds of situations, if they have to take the steps to defend their own property, we're going to see a lot more tragedy. We're going to see a lot more people getting hurt. And that's why it's restoring the law and order in the cities, I think, is a good issue for Republicans. And I absolutely think that it's something that Donald Trump should run on.
My apologies to the team, but we're unfortunately going to have to move on. All of our thoughts are, of course, with Jacob Blake as he is in the hospital, and our thoughts are with him. But we must move on now to issue 3, the 92 RNC and the Buchanan Brigade. In what Real Clear Politics declared as among their top 10 of all-time convention moments, Pat Buchanan delivered what the New York Times called a jarring political message, and what is often referred to as the culture war speech.
Listen, my friends, we may have taken the long way home, but we finally got here to Houston. And the first thing I want to do tonight is to congratulate President George Bush and to remove any doubt about where we stand. The primaries are over, the heart is strong again, and the Buchanan Brigades are enlisted all the way to a great Republican comeback victory in November. My friends, we must take back our cities and take back our culture and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
It is incredible to note that 3 decades later, we are having similar discussions as a nation along the same partisan divide, with the notion of a culture war and a battle for the soul of the country. Ordinarily, we go to Clarence here, but we'll breach a little bit of protocol and naturally we'll jump right to Pat. And Pat, I've got to ask you, do you believe that that historic speech has passed the test of time?
Well, the issue which I introduced, it wasn't new. It goes back to the French Revolution in the 1960s and the changes. But the whole idea of a culture war, which was considered somewhat bold to say that in those times, is now probably in the title of 10,000 books. And there's no doubt about it. What divides us is different views about morality and culture and race and identity and all of these things now, which are tearing this country apart. But they were evident their beginnings in the 1990s. It was a delight up there, and a lot of people have remembered that speech for a long, long time. Not all of them favorably, Seth.
Well, we think it's terrific and certainly a moment in history. Clarence, what are your thoughts on that memorable 1992 speech?
Well, that was the first year I finally got to actually cover both conventions. I remember it very well. But there was the culture war began before Pat's campaign, as Pat well remembers. And it did divide the party that year in the way that I'm more accustomed to seeing Democrats divided, say between their left wing and the center.
Well, remembering that 92 convention, Dan Quayle was also, there was a big story because he was objecting to Murphy Brown, a fictional character, having a baby as a single mother. And Marilyn Quayle, Vice President Dan Quayle's wife, gave a lecture to women that they should stay home and not work, even though she was a lawyer who worked at a home. Those issues seem rather quaint compared to today. Also, the population was a lot whiter than it is today. So same-sex marriage, I'm sure that would be on Pat's list of no-nos. I mean, that is now broadly accepted, sanctified by the Supreme Court.
You know, Eleanor, you weighed in on this topic shortly after the convention in 1992, and we have some interesting footage that we'd also like to share as it relates to your forecast for 1996. Let's take a look.
Give us the early handicap on these potential contenders, Eleanor Clift.
Well, if George Bush wins a second term, Dan Quayle has 4 years to remake his image, but I don't think that's long enough. Pat Buchanan reminded us at the convention, while he will never be president, he's too polarizing. I think he knows it. I don't think he'll run. I think the hope of the Republican Party is with Jack Kemp and William Weld.
Pat ran, but he didn't get very far. He didn't win. He's not president.
Number 2 out of 9.
Jack Kemp was vice president under Bob Dole, and Bill Weld ran a valiant race this time.
We're going to shift focus a little bit, and we're going to go back and dip into time with some thoughts that Clarence expressed regarding the 2000 election. So let's take a look.
Does an independent candidate stand a chance in 2008?
Well, Buchanan, of course, is running as the candidate of what the modern-day populist movement that is opposed to NAFTA, is in favor of a moratorium on immigration. Some of these are very hot issues. I don't know how Buchanan's position on the war would stand now, but you might have a chance because, I mean, your criticisms of the war have been similar to those of people.
You're not going to win. Even I don't believe that.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Clarence, your thoughts there?
I'm trying to remember which war it was now, but well, in any case, what was it Yogi Berra said about how it's hard to tell the future because it hasn't happened yet?
And it seems fitting in this segment that we'll give Pat the final word.
There you go.
Yeah, I think that was the election of 2000, and I only got about 500,000 votes. I'd gotten 3 million in each of the time I ran as a Republican in the Republican primaries.
Okay, it's time for predictions. Pat.
Ms. Pelosi in the House is calling on Joe Biden not to debate Donald Trump because I think she fears the consequences. It'll start a mini movement which will not succeed. Biden will debate.
Eleanor.
Race in Massachusetts on Tuesday, primary race, pits Joseph Kennedy III against Senator Markey, which is a House Democrat of the Kennedy storied legacy, versus Ed Markey, a stalwart of the environmental movement. Markey appears in the last 3 polls taken to have opened up a lead, which was a test of the strength of the progressive movement in the Congress.
Inez.
Alexander Lukashenko will not be the dictator. He will not get a 27th year as dictator and USSR throwback in Belarus, although that doesn't mean the future of the country will be liberal or democratic necessarily. But you can't ignore hundreds of thousands of people marching in the street every day on pain of detention and torture, and just coming right back out every single day, every single weekend. It's been weeks and weeks of this in Belarus, and I think they will succeed in kicking out Lukashenko there.
Clarence.
I predict that Facebook is going to further tighten up their policy about militia groups and others who post on their website after one of the militia groups in Kenosha posted on Facebook. And even though the guy who actually did the shooting was not part of that group, nevertheless, Facebook is taking heat for it.
I predict that all of professional sports will have serious discussions, but conclude that they will not boycott their full seasons or playoffs, and that they will continue to speak very eloquently and loudly in a manner that's going to provide a lot of critical contribution and eloquence to our nation as we're balancing our next steps for social justice. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and we've covered a lot of ground. Please join us on social media, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us.